So why do people with ADHD procrastinate so much? Hi, I'm Dr. LeGrand, and I have ADHD and dyslexia, and it's a question that I get asked a lot on, and a question I ask myself, why do we procrastinate so much? Well, the very first thing that you have to understand about the ADHD brain is that we have a tendency to have low dopamine levels. Now, dopamine is a very important neurotransmitter chemical in our brain that has a lot to do with motivation and drive and the reward system. And if we don't have that motivation and drive, guess what? It's gonna be very difficult for us to do tasks that we simply just do not want to do. We tend to get very overwhelmed. And so when we get overwhelmed with so many different tasks on hand, the chances of us actually doing it on time is very low. So we're going to put it off at the last minute and try to do other things that are going to be more stimulating to our ADHD brain. The second reason of why people with ADHD procrastinate so much is it has to do with our willpower. Now, willpower is very important when it comes to actually task initiation. Not only does our prefrontal cortex of our brain of ADHD is lacking, and therefore it's very hard for us to initiate tasks already, but when it comes to willpower, guess what? Distractions is what depletes our willpower throughout the day. Willpower is kind of like a battery meter. So if you think about like a laptop, whenever you've opened and closed it and open and close it, over time that battery gets depleted. So you can think about every time you open and close, that is just like someone who has ADHD, it gets distracted. So every time you get distracted, your willpower meter starts depleting over time. And if you have constant distractions, especially at the beginning of the day, by the time you hit the middle of the day, you have no energy or willpower to be able to do any task. And so therefore, you're going to be more prone to procrastinating. Now, the third area, this is where a lot of different research and a lot of different psychologists have looked at ADHD extensively when it comes to actually procrastination. And what they have found is when it comes to procrastination, it has to do with more with the difficulty of self-regulating our emotions and our mood, which is something very difficult for people with ADHD. Because when you think about it, when we have a task on hand, whether it's a paper that we have to write or a project that we need to do that is due, well, there's a lot of emotions that come around that because it is stressful to have to do something, a big project, and all the things that we are thinking about of all the things you have to do to actually be able to finish that task at hand. And so therefore you're gonna have a lot of these different emotions. And so it's hard for people with ADHD to regulate those emotions. So therefore we go in the spiral effect of where we feel depressed, anxious, and therefore we don't end up doing the task and we put it off for longer than the average neurotypical person. The fourth reason of why people with ADHD procrastinate so much has to do with time blindness. Now, with people with ADHD, we tend to have that tendency where we put things off. It's more because we don't have the concept of time. Whereas someone with the ADHD brain, where 1 hour can feel like it is a several hours, and that's where we lose track of time. And so therefore we'll put things off because of this time blindness, where we do experience time and time again over and over, which leads into the fifth reason of why people with ADHD tend to procrastinate so much. And this has to do with inattention. There was actually a study done in 2014 where they were trying to understand why people with ADHD tend to be procrastinators. Does it have to do with the ADHD symptoms or does it have to do with something else? And what they found, it had to not do anything with impulsivity, where they first initially thought that it had to do with it. It had to do with maybe being impulsive and just putting off things and never getting things that you should be getting done and doing things that they just enjoy doing that are more rewarding. But what they did find is that the one symptom that they did find with people with ADHD had to do with inattention, where that was the big reason of people with ADHD tend to procrastinate more is because of inattention. Now, if you don't have symptoms of inattention, they didn't see that that was a problem with procrastination. Because if you think about it, every time that you do get distracted or have inattention issues, you forget, and then of course the date gets pushed out. And then of course, when you get distracted over and over again, you're going to realize that finally when someone reminds you to actually do the project, then you put it off at the last minute. So this is very common with people with ADHD. Now that you understand why people with ADHD procrastinate so much, what can you do about it? If you're someone that has ADHD and you procrastinate so much, what can you do? Well, the very first thing that you really need to do is identify what kind of procrastinator you are. So let me break down each one of those. The first type of procrastinator is the dopamine seeker. So obviously people with ADHD have that tendency to have low dopamine, so they're gonna be seeking for the most high stimulating dopamine thing, whether that's playing video games or watching Netflix, hanging out with friends, whatever it might be, they're going to seek that and put off what the project or the homework that they need to be doing. So what I suggest that you should be doing here is try to use the reward system. So you might have to break down your project to smaller chunks, and in between those chunks, it's a reward so that you are more motivated to finish that small chunk of the project, because if you finish this, then guess what? Then you get to play video games or you get to go hang out with friends. So by doing that, that can be very helpful from not procrastinating. The second type of procrastinator is the focus finder. These type of people have a tendency to needing to see the whole picture. They need to see all the puzzles all put together before they're actually going to do and initiate a task. If it's too confusing for the person, they're going to put it off. So if you don't completely understand what the project or the task is at hand, what I suggest that you need to be doing here is, one, either ask your teacher or your boss to really clarify every step. Now, if you're too scared to talk to your boss, maybe talk to a coworker, a friend, somebody that maybe can explain it to you so you see the whole picture. Now, once you understand the whole picture, what I also suggest is to break it up to smaller chunks so it isn't so overwhelming. But now once you've seen the whole picture, you'll have a better chance of actually initiating versus putting it off and procrastinating it. The third type of procrastinator is the emotionally exhausted person. So this is very common with people with ADHD, where you get overwhelmed with so many different tasks that you have to do that you just are exhausted and you don't do any of them. And what I suggest here is, one, is to write down everything that is on your mind, whether things happening in your life, all the projects you have to do, all the responsibilities you have, write it on a piece of paper. So that way it is written down and you don't have to stress about, oh, am I going to forget it? Then you can move on to the most important project, which that is the next step that I would suggest here, is do the most important project first. So at the very beginning of the day, remember when I talked about the willpower issue with people with ADHD, try to do that at the very beginning of the day, because that's when you're gonna have your highest willpower, be able to initiate tasks, versus trying to put it off at the end of the day. The fourth type of procrastinator is the true procrastinator. Now, this is someone that has a tendency to always put things off at the last minute because they feel like, it's when I'm most creative. I'm able to really, the juices are starting to flow. I'm able to write my paper or finish the project because when I put it off the last minute, that's when I'm most creative. Well, that is true in some cases, because there's that pressure, that time pressure, that your brain starts to seem to be magically working. So what I suggest here, if you are that type of person, is set your own deadlines. Do not put your deadlines of what your boss or your professor gives you, but put your own deadlines like 2 weeks or even 3 weeks before the actual deadline. By doing this, you could still procrastinate, but you're procrastinating with your own deadline, so therefore you're really not procrastinating. Trust me, this is what I used to do with myself, because I am a classic person when I do this. When I was in school, I would always put it off last minute because I thought I had the most creative ideas. I was given the suggestion by some professor and I started doing it. I realized that I just had that same creative juices flowing when I set my own deadlines, and therefore I didn't have to stress about really putting it off till the last minute. The fifth type of procrastinator is the perfectionist. So this person has to feel like they have to have everything perfect, in order, everything set and established, all their ducks in a row before they can actually do the task. And what I suggest here has to do with more like, if you have that tendency, is you really need to start cutting it up in smaller chunks. Your project needs to be, even with a paper, if it's like, okay, just doing the first paragraph, okay, if you want that first paragraph to look very perfect, then that's at least a small chunk that you can get done. By doing this, this will help the perfectionism that you do have and to not procrastinate the project. Now, it's really critical to not only implement these strategies, but if you do have ADHD, you really do need to be treating your ADHD. But you really need to understand that there are certain tests that you need to understand of what are the imbalances throughout your brain chemistry, your body chemistry, and what treatment you should be implementing other than just ADHD medication. So you should watch this video right here to understand how to do that. So I'll see you there in that video.